Hello, my name is Colin, and this is it. Blender 2.8 Beta was released earlier this week, and we've got a lot to talk about in this video. It was about 10 years ago this year that I first opened up Blender 2.48, and I pretty much closed it right away because I was used to a different program, and at the time Blender was not as user-friendly. Luckily though, we've gone over several new versions in the last 10 years. We went on to Blender 2.5, which introduced a new layout and design. We've moved on to Blender 2.6, which gave us the Cycles render engine. Then we got Blender 2.7, and here we are today at the beta of Blender 2.8. In this video, I'll be going over about 27 new changes or features or changes in Blender 2.8 that you should know about if you're converting from Blender 2.7 up to 2.8, or if you're just new to 3D and you want to check out what this Blender thing is about. Well, it's a perfect time to get started in Blender for you as well. If you want to try Blender 2.8 beta for yourself, there's a link in the description area below, or you can type in blender.org/2-8 into your web browser and you'll find it. You can go ahead and download it. Before we jump in, of course, if you like this video or if you learned something, go ahead and click on that like button below. It really helps me out. And if you want to see more videos like this one in Blender and in tech, click on that subscribe button as well. Also click on the bell icon to be notified whenever I upload new tutorials. Hopefully that'll be fairly regularly at this point. Also, check out my Facebook page at facebook.com/borncg. On that page, I post news and updates and sneak peeks of what I'm working on next. But let's go ahead and jump in. First up, let's talk about the splash screen, and let's go ahead and zoom in on it so we can take a better look. This splash screen features new badges that you can get if you join the Blender Cloud, if you support the Blender Fund. That is, if you donate €5 or $6 American a month to help support new development of Blender, they give you one of these badges that you can have, or not if you don't want to, on your profile, so you can let others know too that you're supporting the development of future versions of Blender. Below the splash screen is a new quick setup area with a few settings that you can change before you even jump in. And by the way, if you close the splash screen, click, and then you go back up to this little icon, you can get it back up and you can customize your settings again until you change or save any of Blender's other preferences. What's available in here? Well, first of all, if you're coming to Blender from a different 3D program like Maya or 3ds Max, you can change your keyboard shortcuts so that you're more used to how to get around and use Blender. Right now though, we're in beta, so there's only shortcuts, presets to Blender itself and older versions of Blender, because some things have changed. Hopefully they add to this list, but that's that. Next up, just a minor detail here. Select with left click or right click, and by default now you're selecting with left click. Again, that's totally minor. We totally won't talk about that later. Of course we will. Next up is the space bar. You can now use it to play your timeline. You can use it to bring up a tools shortcut bar, and you can use it to search. By default in Blender up until now, it's been for searching, and then they tried to make it in alpha versions of Blender 2.8 into a tools kind of menu. You'll see what that's about in a few minutes. But now they've decided to go and make the spacebar into the industry standard. In other words, in any program where you can play a timeline, like any media player software, if you press the spacebar, it plays. So that's what it does by default now. But of course, you can change them. Lastly, in this section, we have a theme selector, and right now there are only 2 themes to choose from. Of course, in later betas or the final 2.8, there will be lots of themes to choose from. Right now, there's only Blender Dark and Blender Light. I'll stick with Dark for now, okay? Next up is left click to select. Before I get there though, I'm going to change the size of my interface just because everything's a little bit small for you on my screen here. So let's turn it up to 1.35. Okay, and I'll close that. Now in Blender, for the first time after 20 years of right-clicking to select, now in Blender you left-click on objects to select. Of course, if you go to your splash screen, you can change that. If you're used to right-clicking to select, and that's where your muscle memory is, like me, you can stay with right click to select if you want, just like that. But for new users, left click to select really will be easier, so they've made it the default. And yes, it's a big shock, but it's here, but there is no benefit. That's the good news to switching to left click. If you want to stick with right click, you can. What does this mean though? Well, I'm going to be sticking with left click because you get a few differences, and this is how I'm going to be teaching it from this point forward. Of course, if you left click on an object, you select it. That's great. Unfortunately though, the way they've implemented this in some windows, like the timeline, is a little bit weird, and I hope they change it. Right now, if you expect to click on something and to select it with your left mouse button, well, then a new user would be expecting to probably be able to go down to their timeline and then left click and drag this playhead, and unfortunately they can't. You have to right click to drag it, and that's a little bit backwards. You would think they would make it consistent, but really in this case, and there are some cases where it's different, in this case they've just flipped the left and right buttons on the mouse, and that's because when you right click to select, you can left click and drag the playhead, but now that it's reversed, well, you have to right click and drag. So I hope they revisit that, or at least maybe give a new gizmo on this playhead so that you can drag it by left clicking. So now, if you can left click on objects to select them, what happens if you right click in your 3D viewport? Well, with an object selected, if you then right click with your mouse, you get the new object context menu. Now, this menu might look familiar to you if you're used to Blender 2.7 and before, because this menu used to be called the specials menu. Yeah, if I were to switch back over into right click to select, and then I were to press W on my keyboard, you get the same menu. Now in Blender 2.7 and before, you might have used this commonly if you press Tab to go into an object's edit mode, and let's say you wanted to subdivide up your cube, you might have pressed W, and then you might have selected, oh, it's at the top now, subdivide. This is that same menu. But if you're in object mode and you have different types of objects selected, you get even more features now at your fingertips just by right clicking. So if I were to right click on this mesh cube, well, I actually have to change my settings back to left click to select to be able to do that. If I were to right click on my cube, I now have options like smooth shading versus flat shading. So if I switch to smooth shading, you can see my cube is now shaded smooth, which I would probably never do with a cube. So I can go back to flat shading. You can do things here like set the origin of your object to the 3D cursor or geometry or center of mass or something like that. You can convert objects here. So if you wanted to convert a text object into a mesh, you could do that here. And yes, you can even now copy and paste objects with this menu or with Control C or Control V. Oh my god, this is amazing, copying and pasting objects, not just duplicating them. So now if I go to copy object and then right click, paste object, I can now grab with the G key, that hasn't changed, my object, and I've got a copy of it. Let's talk about render engines. Render engines are no longer found on the top bar in Blender, and actually I hope that changes. I think that's a good place for them. But you can now switch between different render engines under the camera tab at the side of the new properties window. So if I click on the camera tab, the very first thing I can change is my render engine, and the new default engine is the new EEVEE render engine. We'll be talking about that, of course, later in this video. Render engines have changed. Of course, we have this new one, EEVEE. We also have a new one called Workbench. This is really just an OpenGL engine. It's kind of like just rendering your viewport. It's simplified. There's no shadows. There's no special effects. It's just how your viewport looks essentially. So if you're looking at your viewport and you have certain settings, you might get a very flat architectural look. It's a nice simple engine, the Workbench engine. The last engine that we have is the Cycles render engine, and the Cycles engine hasn't changed too much. Actually, that's kind of a lie. It's gotten better. On newer, faster hardware, the Cycles render engine is about 30% faster, so hey, Blender is better than ever. But it's a sad day though. The old Blender internal render engine is now gone. They had to get rid of it, unfortunately, because hey, it was just really outdated. It didn't give very good renders if you were really looking to make a high quality, professional looking animated movie or 3D modeled scene. And unfortunately, this is a really sad one. The Blender game engine has now been removed from Blender. The game engine was fun. It was a good educational tool. Some interesting and well-made, great games were made with it, but it never got mobile platform exporting support. So you couldn't export to iPhones, Android phones, things like that. So it never really took off, and so it had to be taken off. And that's in large part because of Blender's new technology and the old technology that the old game engine used. Next up, let's talk about tools and gizmos. Blender's tools are now active, and they're found in large part over in Blender's new toolbar. You can see that when you first launch Blender, you actually get an active tool enabled by default. It's actually the selection box tool, and this tool, as with any other tool now, it takes over your mouse's operation. In other words, with the selection tool, you can left click on something to select it, but also, being this is the box select tool, you can now click and drag and box select things in your scene. Now, as I said, tools are now active, and that means that when you select them, like the new 3D cursor tool, yes, the 3D cursor has been around forever in Blender, but the 3D cursor tool is new, it's active. That means it takes over the functionality of your mouse. If I now click on something, I can't select it. That's because now left clicking it means with this tool selected that I'm moving the 3D cursor around. Same thing with the new transform tool. This is a combination of move and rotate and scale. When I have it up and I want to move or rotate or scale something, I can select something with this tool as well, but I get all three options, so that's great. Yes, before in Blender you could hold shift and select all move, rotate, and scale with the old gizmo selection on the header of the 3D viewport, but now it's just one tool on its own. Of course, we still have move, we still have rotate, and we still have scale, but you'll notice now that the on-screen controls, in other words, the gizmos, have changed. Maybe only subtly, but with the move tool now, if I zoom in on that object, you can see that my gizmo now has these new squares. And that allows me, let's say if I were to grab this blue square, to move the camera on only the X and the Y axes and not the Z axis. In other words, it's colored blue because it negates or does not operate on that blue axis, so I can move it around without worrying about moving it up and down. The scale tool has this too, so you want to scale in two directions, you can do that. You would probably wouldn't want to scale the camera though, so I'll select my cube. And the rotate tool, when you grab one of the three hula hoops, it will actually give you kind of an idea of how many degrees you're turning right there. And if you hold control, it'll snap, but you get this new set of increments that you can actually see to actually give you an idea about how much you're actually turning the object that you're currently rotating. Now, if I go and press Control Z on my keyboard to undo that, and if I press Tab to go into this message edit mode, you can see that my toolbar changes, and we have access to a list of visual icons that represent tools that we commonly use in edit mode. Now, if you don't just want to see thumbnails here, if you want to see the name, you can just put your mouse at the edge of this toolbar and drag out. As you can see, you can have like a column of two, or you can see all of their names, so that might be more helpful for new users if you're not sure what something does. So if I now select, let's say, the extrude region tool, it's active and it takes over my mouse, so I can't do other things with my mouse. It's only going to be for selecting vertices or edges or faces and extruding. So I'm going to go into face select mode. I'm going to left click on one face, and you can see now that the extrude tool has a new gizmo, an on-screen control. So now all I have to do is drag on this little plus icon, and hey, I can extrude. And with this extrude region tool, I can select different regions and I can pull out on the gizmo and extrude. Handy. Let's go ahead and switch to a different tool. I'm going to switch to the loop cut tool. This one works a little bit different than if you were to use Control R on your keyboard. By the way, yes, Control R for loop cut and slide still does work, but this new loop cut tool works a little bit different. You can hover over a mesh in edit mode to use it, and if you then click and then drag immediately, you can drag an edge loop to where you want to go. So you don't click and then let go and then click again to slide. You just click and drag and hold down all in one motion and then let go. So that's the loop cut tool. There are some other new gizmos on the screen as well. A cool new one is for lamps. I'm going to go ahead and select this light in my scene. I'm going to go ahead and change it in the properties window. There's the light tab. I'm going to change it to an area lamp. With an area lamp, or light now as they call it, you have a new circle on the direction of the area lamp, and if you drag it, you can move the way that your lamp is pointing. But also, if you get a little bit closer, you can actually mouse over and change the shape of your lamp, at least the area lamp. I'm going to go ahead and make this one a little bit bigger just over here. I'm going to type in, let's say, 1 and 1. So now if I orbit around, you can see that my area lamp is a square. But again, if I mouse over it, I get these controls, and I can just actually manually change the size of my lamp without having to go into any settings. Now, this tool I think is a little bit buggy right now. At least I don't understand it, maybe because it should work, and it's not. But again, we have that context menu, so if I right click on the light, I can actually set its size, both X and Y, and if I just select size, it actually fixed it, and it actually made it that bigger size, and it's letting me now stretch it on the X-axis, and I can right click again and set the Y as well. So we have new Gizmos on-screen controls for tools and active tools. Speaking of tools, let's talk about tool settings. If you're using a tool now, there are a few new places that you can find that tool settings. Let's say I want to use the loop cut and slide tool. So I'm going to go ahead and zoom in on my cube. I'll press tab. I'm going to select that new active loop cut tool right there. Now, when I select it, that's what my mouse is going to do. It's going to create a new loop cut and let me slide it. Of course, if I now click and drag, it'll just put it right there. But what if I want more than one cut? As you know, if you were to press, I'm going to switch over to my move tool. If I were to press Control R on my keyboard to create a new loop cut and slide, I can scroll up on my mouse to get more cuts. Then I can click and then move my mouse and click again. So I can create more than one cut with that loop cut tool. So how do I do that with the new loop cut tool, the active one on my toolbar? Well, I'll just undo those quickly, and I'm going to go back to loop cut. Tool options are now just like the Adobe products like Photoshop or Illustrator or Animate. You get tool options at the top. So if I want to change the options for this tool, the most common ones will be up here. I can change the number of cuts over here. So now if I were to just use my tool and then click and drag, you can see that I have that number of cuts up there. Now, the most common options for tools will be up here in this new top bar. But if you want to see all the options for any given tool, let's say the extrude region tool, you'll want to go up to the top tab of your properties window. This is a new tab. It's called the, I'll just hover over it so it'll tell me what it's called, the active tool and workspace settings. You can see here, this has sections in it. They're different for every tool. You can expand these out and you can see options for the tool that you have selected. In this case, I've got the extrude region tool selected, so I can extrude based on this face's normal, or I can extrude in the global X, Y, or Z axes. Now, this top toolbar is going to come in really handy if, let's say, you want to do a task like texture painting. In fact, I'm going to go up to my new texture paint tab at the top, and as you can see, this new texture paint tab, we'll talk about workspaces in a few moments, but as you can see, I now can access my draw brush, and if I'm drawing or painting on an image, I'm going to click on new and press OK. Actually, I'll change this to a white new picture. I can now choose up here in my top bar the color and radius and other properties of my brush. So if I want to paint not with white, but if I want to paint, let's say, with red, I want to change the radius of my brush, I can do that, and now I can paint on that image. So this is going to be a handy place for you to find settings for your current active tool. Next up are workspaces. Workspaces are new ways of rearranging your screen and quickly getting into active tool sets to start getting into a task right away. Yes, you can still go to the top or bottom of any window and put your mouse in the corner of a window and left click and drag to split that window into two, either left and right or again up and down, and you can still change any window into any window type. Let's say I change the 3D viewport into a, I don't know, a timeline. Yes, you can still do that. But now, I'm going to go up and actually go to New and General. But now, you can change your layouts even easier. But again, this goes into more than just window layouts. The list of tabs at the top are called Workspaces, and they're organized in a general file like you're creating a 3D animated movie. When you're creating a 3D animated movie, the workflow generally is professionally that you do layout first. That means you're creating very, very simple low poly objects, to lay out how a set's going to be organized, like where tables and chairs and cars and city streets and buildings will be. And then you go into modeling, so actually modeling in more detail what objects are going to look like. And then you might go into sculpting if that object requires it. And then you might go into texturing, like UV editing and painting, or texture painting. Then you might go into shading and actually customizing the materials and the shininess and dullness and reflectiveness of objects. Then you would probably animate, so you need different windows for that. Then you'd probably render, and then lastly you might composite, and I don't actually know why they have scripting here, but they do. Now that's a workflow for 3D animation. But what if you're doing a different task? Blender also has new tools that are great for 2D animation and other things as well. That's why if you go to File and New, you get a list of preset templates for actual Blender files. I just use General, that's what I'll be using most of the time, but there's also a preset for 2D animation. And so if you go to 2D animation, you get a different set of workspaces. You get the general 2D animation canvas, you get a full canvas, and then you get a rendering workspace. If I go to File, New, and Sculpting, let's say you're used to ZBrush and you want to try that same sort of thing in Blender, well, this gives you sculpting and shading for making objects using the sculpt tools and changing their materials. So as you can see, workspaces are not only layouts, they're also active tool sets, and you can make your own presets, of course, as well. Let's talk about these new controls at the top right of the 3D view window. This is one of the new most recognizable features of Blender 2.8. You get some new controls which let you change your view very easily. Now forever, as long as I've been teaching Blender, I've recommended that you need a mouse to use Blender. If you're using a laptop, you need to plug a mouse in because you need a scroll wheel, and a scroll wheel that acts like a button in order to do simple things like orbit in your scene or to zoom in and out in your scene. And then if you hold Shift on your mouse and then you orbit by, of course, pressing your middle mouse button down, you can pan around in your scene. So if you didn't have a mouse, if you're using a laptop, well, you kind of had to be a second-rate citizen when it came to Blender. That is no longer the case. We now have this new gizmo, yeah, it's that word again, gizmo, on the screen, that if you just put your mouse in it and then you left-click and drag around, that's a way that you can orbit your scene. So now you really don't need a mouse. You can just use your trackpad and click and drag and move around. That's great, but this little gizmo is more powerful than that. You see, if I click on one of the little balls at the end of the points of the gizmo, you can point your view in that direction. In other words, if I click on the little Z ball, you can see that I go to my top view. If I click again on it, you can see I flip over to my bottom view. You'll also notice that if I orbit around, it switches automatically between a user perspective view or a perspective view. And if I click on one of the little balls, let's say I want to go to the right or left of my scene, I can go to that side and it switches into orthographic automatically. So now it's easy to go from left to right. Right now I'm in right. I can click again on the X to go to left. If I want to go to the front, or back, I can do that really easily. Again, top and bottom, very, very easy to do. Next to this gizmo are a few buttons to help you do other navigation tasks. You can click on this little magnifying glass, and if you click and hold on it and move your mouse up and down, that will let you zoom in and out really easily, so that's great. Next, this little hand, if again I click and drag on it, up and down and left and right, I can pan my scene around. And if I want to switch into the camera view, there's a button for that. Easily I can get into the camera, and I can press it again to get out of the camera. And lastly, if I'm in a perspective view and I want to go into orthographic, that means a more flat view, I can press this last little button and it toggles between, again, this is orthographic, it looks more flat, but it is still 3D, and perspective view. So those are the new controls at the top right of the 3D viewport window. Next up, let's talk about Blender's improved user interface. Lots of little things have been tweaked to make Blender even nicer to look at and easier to use. One of the themes that they went into developing Blender 2.8 with was making things more consistent and easier to find for the user. The first place you'll notice this is the header bar of each of the windows. Up until now, in previous versions of Blender, the header of a window, that bar at the top or bottom of the window, could be found on the top or bottom. In the old 3D viewport window, the header was on the bottom, and some windows it was on the top. It's called a header, so they've always put it on the top now, and you can always click in the same spot in the top left on that little button to change that window's type. Just a nice little thing here to do with consistency. Another major area where the interface has been improved is over here in the Properties window. The Properties window used to have tabs along the top, and now they're along the side. Yes, these icons have been a little bit controversial. They are monochromatic, so they're a little bit harder to identify what they are, and yes, I agree with some of that criticism, but being on the left-hand side means that you can now maximize your 3D viewport space by making this side panel of windows narrower. So now you can have all your tabs at the side and you can actually see them all. If you would try to do that before in Blender 2.7 and before, if you had tabs along the top, you had to make this window at least wide enough to see all the tabs. Otherwise, you'd be cutting some of the tabs off and you'd have to actually make your window wider and then select the tab that you'd want to go into that mode of this properties window. Then you can make the window narrower again. Having side tabs makes that no longer necessary. Just about a week ago also, they made it so that you could actually not just click on a button, but you could also just click in this area and drag. So if I want to explore these tabs, I can just find the one that I'm looking for, and then, oh, there's the world tab. I can now let go. So that's great. Besides that, in this properties window, if you go to a section, you'll notice that the sections are now reorganized, they're tidied up, but they also have a single column layout. Before, in Blender 2.5 to 2.7, you would actually have these value input boxes side by side, and it was actually quite messy. Now, no matter what section you go into, you'll find that there's only one of these value input areas next to its description. So it's much easier to find your way around, it's just more tidy, but also this allows you to have a narrower, again, side properties window, so you're maximizing your 3D viewport space. In fact, what I've gotten in the habit of doing in the last few weeks is I've gotten the habit of making two of these windows side by side, because you can still see everything. That means you can have two different tabs side by side. Let's say you want to have your render settings with the camera over here, or maybe in this one, and then over here you'll have material settings for the object that you currently have selected. So now I can go ahead and, let's say, add a color to my object. Now, besides that, another change that you'll notice is in each of these sections, or rather in some of the sections, you're going to see some presets. Let's look at this output tab. And by the way, they've actually rearranged the content of the render settings tab to exclude things that have to do with the output settings of your final render. Now, the camera tab only has settings to do with your scene, like samples and depth of field and shadows and volumetric lighting and things like that. That's all under the render tab. This new output tab that looks like a little film canister with film popping out of it now has all of your export or output settings. Things like dimensions and frame rate and start and end frames and output format, like if you're exporting to a JPEG sequence or a still image or a video file with sound. All those settings are now here. But these sections all now, like dimensions, has presets. So I can actually choose not just 1080p 1920 by 1080, but if I want to choose, let's say, 4K, I can do that with simply 2 clicks. Now, it doesn't actually go away. I hope they make this menu close, but as you can see now, I have 3840 by 2160, which is essentially 4K. The last little tweak they've made is that in areas where you can animate values, if I say go to the Object Properties tab, you can see that I've got these new little dots next to my value boxes. What these little dots mean is that if I click on it, this is how you can add a keyframe. So let's say I click on this little dot and this section goes yellow. That means I've made a keyframe of this object on its x-axis at this current frame. If I right click and drag down to frame, let's say 24, and then I move that value, I can just drag in that area, and then I click on the keyframe again, I've just created an animation. I now have an animation of my box going from the middle, sliding along the x-axis, so I can now animate. That's a nice user interface improvement. Let's talk about Blender's preferences. Blender's preferences used to be found under the File menu, and they're no longer there. They're now under the Edit menu because that's sort of the industry standard. If you're used to any of the Adobe programs like Photoshop or Premiere or Animate, you'll always find preferences under the Edit menu. It's just industry standard. So now we're moving towards that in Blender. I can go to the Edit menu, select Preferences. The other change here is that now I can see there are side tabs rather than top tabs. I think they're going to be playing with this idea more. and rearranging some of this main preferences window space to better be laid out for having side tabs, but here they are. You can still save your preferences over here. So if I were to, let's say, go to my input tab, and if I were to, let's say, be on a laptop without a numpad, and I wanted my number row to act like my numpad, I could emulate my numpad. I might also, under interface, select rotate around selection. If I want to save these settings for every time I use Blender, of course I can save preferences, but do note that if you do click on this save preferences, your quick little settings area, your quick setup area will no longer be there. So those are Blender's preferences. Let's talk about collections and the outliner window. No longer does Blender have layers. If you think back to Blender 2.7, layers was that little grid of squares that represented layers that were kind of like layers in Photoshop or GIMP, but really how I explained them were parallel universes. You could separate objects, lamps, anything in your scene, you could separate them into layers, so you could view one layer at a time, or you could hold shift and view multiple layers at a time. Unfortunately, layers were limited. You could only have about 20 of them. So now in Blender 2.8, we have what are called collections, and collections are more versatile and they're unlimited, and you're pretty much going to always manage them over here in the outliner window. By default, you're given one collection, and a collection is really just a group. You can move objects between different collections, and you can create new collections really easily. In fact, if I select my cube and I press M on my keyboard, you can see now I'm not moving to a different layer, I'm moving to a collection. And by default, we only have one collection named collection, so I'm going to click on the word new collection. I can click in here and I can name it. I can call it Happy Monkey with Party Hat. I swear this will make sense in a second, and I can press OK. So now my cube is in this happy monkey with a party hat collection. Now let's say that I actually want to make that collection have what I say. So I'm going to select my cube now, and I'm going to move it to a different collection. I'm going to make a new collection just by right-clicking over here and saying New, and I'll double-click on this, and I'm going to say Boring Cube, and I'll press enter, and I'm going to select my cube, tap M, move it to my boring cube, and now in my happy monkey with party hat collection, in fact, I'm actually going to hide this collection, the boring cube collection, and so now with my happy monkey with party hat collection, I'm going to press Shift A on my keyboard, I'm going to add a monkey, and it is in that collection, and I'm going to add a cone on top of it, and I'll tap G and Z to move that up. So now my collection is complete. As you can see, I can have a unlimited number of collections here. I can group in any way. Objects can actually be part of multiple collections, I believe. And a cool thing you can do is you can actually add instances of collections. So if I press Shift A on my keyboard and go to add, and I go down to collection instance, you can see now I can add instances of, well, not my boring cube, but my happy monkey with party hat. So now I actually have a reference copy of my monkey with party hat. And if I change my original, so if I left click on this hat, if I press tab to go into edit mode, I'll go into face select mode, select the face, extrude it down, I'll hold Control and Alt and click on edge there to select that edge ring, and I'll tap Alt E on my keyboard and extrude faces along normals. Yeah, I went quick there, but that's okay. I now have a monkey wearing a witch hat, and as you can see, that changed the instance as well because it's a reference instance. So now you can change lots of things in your scene really quickly, and you can create instances of your collections. Next up, let's talk about Blender's new 3D viewport window. Just looking at it in the 3D viewport, you can tell things have changed a little bit. It looks a little bit more 3D, and that's because when you look at things that are farther away, especially lines and wireframe models, you can tell when things are closer to you and farther away because lines, like the grid floor lines here, look a little bit more solid and thick when they're closer, and then a little bit more faded away as you get into the background. This is also true if I were to go into wireframe view and look at the different wireframe thicknesses. You can just tell, of course, there are thicker outlines on objects, but you can also just tell, especially, let's say if I were to press X and delete this cube, and if I were to press Shift A and add a new mesh monkey head, you can just tell when things are closer to you, and that's great. But one of the bigger things about this new viewport are overlays. Now in Blender 2.8, you can control exactly what you can see in your viewport. Let's say you don't want to see your grid floor. Well, up here under this overlays new pull down menu, you can see I can really turn anything on or anything off. In fact, with wireframe mode, I actually have control over how much wireframe I can see. If I zoom in on the monkey, you can see these lines are certain thicknesses, but if I turn this value down, you can see I can see fewer wireframes, and that might be helpful to you in some circumstances. I'm not really sure, but let's say I want to turn off the grid floor. Well, I can do that. I can actually turn off the axes, so I don't have to see that red and green line. I can turn on the Z-axis line if I want to. I can turn off the grid floor, so you can really customize what you can see in your view, but also you can change the shading of your viewport. What does that mean? Well, right now when I'm in this wireframe view, I can select either my theme background color, so this is the background color that came with Blender's dark theme, but I can also select a world color, and that means under my world tab, this is actually the render output color. I can change the color, so I can go to some wacky orange red color if I want to. Ugh, that's garish. And I can switch also to a viewport color, which I can actually customize for just this viewport. I can change it to something a little bit more pleasant, like, I don't know, a light blue. Also, we have a new X-ray mode. This little button used to be called Limit Selection to Visible, and now it's either called X-ray or Show Whole Scene Transparent. What this means, I'm actually going to go back into solid view, is that you can turn on X-ray. You can make all of your objects see-through simply by clicking this one button. Now, as you can see now, if I look really closely at my mesh, I can see into the background. But what I might also do is I can actually turn on wireframe while I'm in solid view, so I can see the outlines of each individual face on my monkey head. If I press tab to go into edit mode, and then let's say I press Alt-A to deselect all, I can now see geometry in the back. And while I'm in this new, what is it called again? Show Whole Scene Transparent, or X-ray mode, I can select things. So I'm actually going to press W a few times on my keyboard and get that circle select tool, and I'll make my radius a bit bigger. If I paint now while I'm in this X-ray view, I can paint a selection and it will include faces, or vertices in this case, in the background. But if I were to undo that and then turn this limit selection to visible, that's the old name for it, the X-ray button off, and I were to paint a selection now, it would only select vertices in this case that I can see, and not any vertices in the back of the mesh. So that's the X-ray button and the new 3D viewport. Let's talk about viewport shading. If I have my mouse in the 3D viewport and I press Z on my keyboard, it brings up a new pie menu. And these 4 options are the 4 new viewport shading modes of the new 3D viewport. By default, you start in solid view, and solid view, or viewport shading, lets you see objects in a fairly plain looking white or gray color. In solid viewport shading, you cannot see material colors, but what you can do is change the overall shading of solid view. Right now I'm using studio lights, and so my scene kind of has a light blue shade over it. But if I switch to, let's say, flat lighting, well, now I can't really see the contour of objects at all, and that might be what you want, especially if you're rendering out and you want architectural drawings and you want to be able to see outlines. You might actually turn on, let's say, wireframe, so you want to render out just an object with very plain lights. That's what you might do. You can also change your studio lighting, which we had before, but you can change it to different sorts of light modes. So if I want to see my entire scene with a white material, but in a sunset, I can do that. So you can imagine a whole white scene where maybe you're doing a layout of a city street, but you want to see it from a sunset. Well, now you can get it. We also have, if you press Z, a new Look Dev mode. And this Look Dev mode is great for texturing and painting textures on images, because the Look Dev mode lets you actually see colors and materials and image textures. So now with my cube selected, we are in this third mode, Look Dev mode. I can go and add a new material to this object. I'll give it a color, let's say green. I can see it. If I press Z and go back into solid view, I can't see those materials anymore. Next up, if I press Z, I go into wireframe mode. We've already talked about this one. It's great for seeing your scene simply and through your object. That's great. If I press Z one more time, you get the new render view. And because the default engine in Blender and in the viewport is the EEVEE render engine, wow, is this fast. You can really see how your scene's going to look in the EEVEE render engine in real time. And when you move your mouse around, it's just rendering in real time. It's really amazing. So it's a great new 3D viewport and different viewport shading modes. Of course, if you're in any of the modes, including rendered, you'll notice that in rendered view, I can still see all of my overlays, or I can turn them off and see how exactly my scene will look, especially if I go and press 0 to look through my camera. Hey, I'm actually seeing my scene without having to render. Of course, there are different options for each of these different modes under shading. Actually, it looks like there is no options for rendered view under shading. That's because you actually have to change your render settings under the camera tab. So those are the 4 new viewport shading modes: rendered, solid, look dev, and wireframe. Let's look at popovers. Popovers are a new interface convention in Blender 2.8 where you might have an area pop up over your screen with settings or tools for something that you're currently working on. If I go ahead and delete my default cube with the X key and I press Shift A and add a new, let's say, UV sphere. If you added a new UV sphere in Blender 2.7 or before, you would have gotten a little section at the bottom of your side tool shelf to let you change the properties of this UV sphere. This UV sphere has a lot of polygons, but I might want a simpler polygon. Well, where do I find that? Well, it's now under this new little pop-up, and you can click on a little arrow to expand it. This is what a pop-up looks like. It's a dark area. It's just like one of the other menus that looks like that, but here with this pop-up, it's temporary. I can change things like the segments. I can turn down the number of segments, and I can turn down the number of rings if I want a lower poly UV sphere, and I can even change the radius here. But then, just like in Blender 2.7 and before, as soon as you click something else or off of it, that little pop-up will go away. So this is a new convention in Blender 2.8. You'll be seeing more pop-ups here and there. Let's talk about Blender's new status bar. And for this one, I'm going to have to zoom way in on my interface. So I'm going to go up to Edit and Preferences and change my interface scale all the way up to 2, and I'll close that window. There is a bar at the bottom of Blender that gives you hints about what you can work on next, or what you can currently do with your mouse. In other words, if I select an object, well, what do I do next? Well, down in the status bar, it shows me what I can do with where my mouse currently is. So right now, my mouse is in the 3D viewport, and I have the cube selected. Let's say I go and use the transform tool. Well, as you can see, I can now, with my left mouse button, there's a little picture right down there, I can select or deselect. So if I click on something, I can select it, or if I click on nothing, I can deselect it. That's great. If I have this transform gizmo up, it'll say, hey, you can transform from the gizmo. In other words, I can use my gizmo and I can scale, or I can rotate, or I can move. What else can I do? Well, with my middle mouse button, I can orbit in my view or rotate the view. And if I want to bring up a menu, right there, it says call menu. Hey, I can call a menu up onto my screen. Now, if my mouse is in other windows, you can see that it changes. With my mouse in the timeline, you can see now I can select keyframes by left clicking. I can transform keyframes by left clicking and moving my mouse. I can pan my view by pressing my middle mouse button down like a button and then moving my mouse around. And I can change a frame by right clicking on it. In other words, I can right click and drag my playhead. Now, if I'm in an objects or meshes edit mode, it becomes even more useful. I'm going to go ahead and press Tab to go into my cube's edit mode. And then if I press K to go into knife mode, you can see now on this bottom bar, I have all of my little hints and shortcuts about how I can use this tool. So if I'm using this tool, I might click and then click to make a cut across my mesh, and that's great. But as you can see, E will let me make a new cut. So if I tap E on my keyboard, my first cut stops, and now my mouse is free to make another cut. That's wonderful. If I press E again, I can do that again. I can use Control L or Control R to turn midpoint snap off or on. I can use Shift L or R to ignore snap. I can press C to enable angle constraint. And if I tap Z on my keyboard, I can cut through an object. And I'm going to go ahead and press Enter. So now I have a cut through with that one specific cut that I made. So that's Blender's new status bar. Units. Units in Blender have always been a little bit weird. By default, up until now, Blender was measured, or scenes were measured, using the Blender unit. And that really doesn't mean anything, especially if you're making models to a specific size and you want to use millimeters or centimeters or inches or feet or yards. So in Blender now, the metric system is default. If I go over to my properties window and under the scene tab, you can see I have a section called units, and yes, by default, the metric system is default. If you'd rather use the imperial system with inches and feet, you're welcome to, but now you have even more control, and this area is simplified in terms of its interface of what exactly you're using. So imperial could mean inches or feet. So which one is it going to measure in? Well, you could actually change that. You can change the length value to feet. If you always want to work in inches, you can do that. If you're using the metric system and you want to always measure every length in meters, you can do that, or you can switch over to centimeters if that's what you want. Or what you can do, especially for length, is if you want to have different measurements depending on the size of the object or how zoomed in you're in, I'm not really sure, you can change this length value to adaptive. And so now if you're working on things at different scales, it'll adapt to what you actually want to see. So if I open up especially my N side, that's that little plus side properties panel, you can see I'm in meters, but if I'm working on another object or maybe zoomed in, it might change to centimeters, and it might vary depending on what you have selected. What you can also do when you're in edit mode, this is a cool one, this is a new overlay. If I press tab on a mesh to go into edit mode and I open up overlays, I get even more options here than if I was to be in object mode. You can see it's smaller, but in edit mode I can actually enable edge length. So where is this? Edge length, there we go. So now I can see all of the measurements of every edge in my model. Pretty cool, hey? That's measurements and units in Blender 2.8. One of the many new great features of Blender 2.8 is multi-object editing. Let's say in Blender 2.7, if I had two objects in my scene, two meshes, I'm gonna go ahead and press Shift A on my keyboard, and I'm gonna add, oh yeah, let's go ahead and add a mesh monkey head, and I'm gonna use the move tool and move it over. Let's say I wanted to edit that monkey head's mesh. So of course, I would select it, I would press tab to go into edit mode, and I could work on it, that's great. But then what if I realized that I wanted to work on this cube? Well, I would have to press tab to go back into this monkey head's object mode, and then I could switch over and select the cube and press tab to go into its edit mode. Wouldn't it be nice to have edit mode in multiple objects at the same time? Yes, it would be, and it's now in Blender 2.8. If I press tab to go back into object mode, and then I select more than one object at the same time, of course you can hold Shift and do that. You can hold Shift and click on a second object or as many meshes as you want, or you can use the box select tool and select multiple objects. But if you have more than one mesh selected, you can press tab. That'll go into edit mode of both meshes, and as you can see now, I can select faces of both objects, and I can move them around, and so now I can edit two meshes at the same time. And if I press tab, I'll go back into object mode of both, and now they're both still separate objects. So that's multi-object editing. Let's talk about rendering. If I want to go ahead and render this beautiful scene right now, my cube, of course I might want to go through my camera mode, and then I'd want to press either animation or render. And that used to be in Blender 2.7 and before under the camera tab. But as you can see, it's no longer there. So what do? Well, of course, you can press the F12 key, the function 12 key on your keyboard. If I do that, that still works. It pops up with a new window by default, and I get my render, and that's great. But where else can I find this in my interface without actually using a keyboard shortcut? Well, it's up under the render menu, and I'm not sure why they got rid of the render buttons. I really wish they would bring them back, or they could actually bring it back up here or somewhere in the top of Blender's interface. That would be nice too. But they're now under render. So you can render image or animation. If you want to change how your render shows up or where it shows up, you can go to display mode, and by default, new window is selected. So when you press F12 or go to render image or animation, it will render in a new window that pops up over top of Blender. If you want to change that, you can change that to one of the other options. I can make it go to an image editor. So now what it'll do, I think it actually takes over the largest window that you have in Blender. So in this case, it should actually replace my 3D viewport window with an image editor with my render. So if I press F12, yeah, it changed my 3D viewport into my UV image editor window with the render, and I can press escape to go back to my 3D viewport. So a few little things about rendering have changed, but it's not too different. Let's talk about materials. Materials in Blender have gotten a lot easier, in part because of the EEVEE render engine and in part because of Blender's new default material. If you were using Blender 2.7 or before and the Cycles render engine, you would be used to the fact that if you took a new mesh, so I'm going to actually get rid of my default cube and I'm going to add, let's say a torus, and I want to add a material to that torus. Of course, I would go to the Material tab in the Properties window and I would press New, and if I was using the Cycles render engine in Blender 2.7, I would have gotten a basic diffuse material. A diffuse material is basically just a color, so you can change the base color, now it's called, to a different color, and you can change your viewport shading to look dev or rendered. So now I can see the color, but a diffuse material, the old way in the Cycles render engine, didn't have many other settings. The new default material is called the Principled BSDF shader, and this is basically your all-purpose, all-in-one shader that lets you change many things about your material, like how shiny or dull it is, or really customize it to your liking. You can do it all in one place. Now this Principled BSDF shader is actually a PBR shader. That means a physically based rendering shader. And what that means is that it's actually more realistic, especially in the way that it reflects other things in your scene. If I were to say, make my donut or torus look smooth, of course, I might right click on it and enable smooth shading. Then I might add under the wrench tab a subdivision surface modifier, and I wanted this to look like a very shiny donut. Well, under the material tab right there, I can turn down the roughness, and that makes it more glossy, especially if I had more things in my scene to reflect. But more like in the real world, and this is why a physically based rendering material really is a good thing, is that when you look at shiny objects in the real world, the way they reflect is not even. Up until now, if you were to use a glossy material in, let's say, Cycles, materials would reflect the same no matter which way you looked at them, and that's not really how materials reflect things in real life. If you look at, let's say, a car's glossy finish, well, if you look straight into a car's glossy finish, you're probably just going to see the colors and a little bit of reflection. Whereas if you were to look at the edge of your car, looking at it from the side and across, let's say, the hood of your car, well, you would actually see more reflection of other things in the background, let's say your house or trees or the horizon or the sky, looking at an object from an angle. This is also true with water. If you're standing at the edge of a lake and you look into water, well, it's transparent, most likely. You can probably see into it a little bit, and you're not going to see that many reflections. Whereas if you were to look across the lake at the water at a distance, at more of an angle, you'd probably not see through the water at all. You would see all the reflections. This is called the Fresnel effect, and the joke is everything has Fresnel, and that's true with PBR shaders. It's now an improvement in Blender, and one of the nice things about using this Principled BSDF shader is that you can switch between the EEVEE render engine and the Cycles render engine, and your materials will stay the same and they'll look the same, and it'll all just work great. Let's talk about rendering, specifically in the EEVEE render engine. Of course, if you press Z on your keyboard, you can switch into the rendered viewport shading mode. And then if you turn off overlays with this button right here, you can see essentially what your render will look like when you actually press F12. But of course, you always render through the camera, so I'm going to go ahead and press 0 on my numpad, and I want to orbit my camera a little bit, so I'm going to press N to bring up that side panel, and I'll lock camera to view. If I zoom in and I press F12 to bring up my actual render, you'll notice that the quality is not as good as you might expect from another render engine like the Cycles render engine. And that's primarily because of a few things. But number one are reflections and bounce lighting, and number two are shadows. And those two things really go hand in hand. In the EEVEE render engine, yes, you're not going to get quite the quality that you would get from the Cycles render engine, but in reality, the reason why this render doesn't look as good as the Cycles render engine is because of settings that you have to enable. Yes, you can make some amazing things like this, and like this, and like this, and finally like this. In the EEVEE render engine, you can get some pretty great results, but you have to enable certain settings in your render settings. The first thing I'll talk about here is the fact that you don't get bounce lighting for free in the EEVEE render engine. What am I talking about? Well, if my red monkey head was sitting on a gray floor, you would probably get some of the bounce light from the red monkey head bouncing onto the gray floor, and so you would get some red in other parts of the picture. Likewise, if you had an image texture or a checkerboard tile pattern on the floor, you would see the reflections of that up on the monkey head. Well, right now we don't get any of that, and that's because of bounce lighting. How do we enable this? Well, under your camera tab, we have many settings here that we need to enable in order to get a higher quality render with more realism. So the first thing I'm going to enable is called screen space reflections, and this is how very easily, just by clicking the checkbox, we can get a little bit of reflection in our scene. I'll turn it off and I'll turn it back on again. As you can see, the lighting changed a little bit, and you can see a little bit of redness in the floor under the monkey head. Now, this is going to be helped if I actually select the floor. I'll turn overlays back on so you can see that I have it selected. And if I make this material more glossy, so under the material tab, I'm going to turn down the roughness on the floor. And as you can see now, I get a reflection, and that's because I've enabled screen space reflection. So I'm going to turn that off and then back on again, and you can really adjust these things in both this section and also of course with the settings of your material. So I might turn up the metallic property of my floor, play with the amount of specular value. It really comes down to a lot of these different settings. Also, the first thing that I noticed with the EEVEE render engine is the quality of the shadows. When you first look at your scene, you'll notice your shadows will be quite rough, and this is because EEVEE does not have proper ray tracing. How do we solve this? Well, if I zoom out and I select a lamp in my scene, I can adjust its shadow properties right in its own properties under the light tab in the properties window. Just if I expand shadow, of course you can turn shadows off or on, but what I probably want to do here is make my shadows a bit softer. So I'm going to turn softness up on this individual light, and as you can see, my shadows look a little bit better, but actually there's a better way. So I'm going to turn that back down. I'm going to right click and reset that to its default value. Instead, I'm going to go to the render settings, and under the shadow section, there's more settings here that will affect your shadows than anything. There's a few different methods of drawing shadows, ESM and VSM. Back in earlier alpha versions of 2.8, I found that there was more difference between these two, but they've both gotten better. But what I can do here is I can enable soft shadows. When I do that, and only when I do that, does the size of a lamp matter? Because if I didn't have this turned on, and let's say if I had a larger lamp, so I'm going to turn my lamp into an area lamp, and I'm going to change the size to 3 meters by 3 meters. You can see that this size of a lamp in a realistic situation, including in the Cycles render engine, would cause the shadows to be diffuse. They would be very, very blurry, because that's what naturally happens when you have a large light source. I was very disappointed to see that this was not the case in the EEVEE render engine. But how do you solve this? Well, it's easy. You go to your camera tab, you enable soft shadows. As you can see now, they've gotten nice and soft. Now you might notice that they don't look quite as smooth as you would like. That's just because of the sampling in EEVEE. By default, in your viewport, you only get 16 samples. That means 16 different layers or increments of your shadows, but when you render out, you can have much more. So if I turn my viewport even up to 64 and press enter, the shadows look smoother. So you can imagine if you had 256 or 512, your render would look great. Let's just do a quick test. And as you can see, the shadows look pretty decent. There's a few things missing though, and that is the shadows under the monkey head where it's nearest to the floor. It doesn't look very realistic. What's happening here is we need to enable an extra shadow called contact shadows. This is especially apparent when you have hard shadows and when you have something directly touching the ground. So I'm going to get rid of my monkey head. I'm going to add a cube and I'm going to move it up on the Z-axis so it's on the floor, and I'm going to disable for a moment under my camera tab under shadows, soft shadows. As you can see, if I were to get rid of the glossiness on the floor, you can see where the shadow meets this corner of the cube isn't realistic. It just doesn't seem to match up well. Well, how you can solve that with your lamp selected, what you can do is under the lamp's own settings, you can enable contact shadows. And when you enable contact shadows, it makes an extra little shadow where your object meets the floor. And I'm going to increase the distance of this here. You can see that that helps, and I might increase the softness. The softness of your contact shadow is not affected at all by the size of your lamp. So you actually have to adjust that one manually. But once you have contact shadows, things look a lot better. Something else you might want to do is enable ambient occlusion. That just helps make areas darker where ambient light from light sources, is occluded. That's what that means. So it's right here under the camera tab. And if I enable it, you'll see things get a little bit darker, especially near corners. So what I might do is I might turn up the distance of that, and as you can see, things are getting a little bit darker in here. It doesn't matter too much right now, but it really does help in certain situations. Let's talk about the timeline. The timeline in Blender 2.8 has gotten a little bit of a makeover, and that is in the way that it deals with keyframes. If I want to make an animation, of course I can turn on my red, actually it's not red anymore, but it's still the record button. In other words, it's the automatic keyframe insertion button. If I have this pressed and it's enabled, what I can do is I can pose objects, and when I pose them or move them or rotate them or scale them at frames, they'll be recorded in that pose at that frame. So on frame 1, what I'll do is I'm going to move my cube over to the side, and here you can see a difference. In Blender 2.7 and before, in the timeline, keyframes just showed up as lines, and you couldn't select them, and you couldn't move them, and you couldn't scale animations. In order to do that, you had to use the dope sheet window. Let's just follow through with this. I'm going to go ahead and right click and drag to, let's say, frame 24, and I'm going to drag my cube over, and because I have this record button turned on, I have now 2 keyframes and I have an animation. But as you can see in the timeline, I can select keyframes. I wasn't able to do that before. Of course, I'm left clicking to select now, and I can left click and drag to move keyframes. Again, I couldn't do that before. Up until now, you had to actually make another window. You had to have a timeline in order to have this record button. I'll turn it off now. And you had to have a timeline in order to press the play button. And what I used to teach is you had to go up to the top and drag the corner of the window down to get another window, and you would turn this into a dope sheet, and the dope sheet let you have these diamond shaped and movable keyframes. But now the timeline has those too, so the dope sheet has been made less necessary, although it still exists. Custom shortcuts. In Blender 2.8, you can add your own quick shortcuts to a new menu that you access using the Q key on your keyboard. If you press Q when your mouse is in the 3D viewport, you get the quick favorites menu, but by default there are no quick favorites because this is for you to customize. If I want to add a quick favorite, let's say I need to access something in a menu and I don't want to have to go up to that menu every time because it's something that I do all the time. Let's say I get rid of my cube and I press Shift A and I add a new text object, and I'll press Tab to go into edit mode of it, and I'll press backspace and I'll type Born CG, and let's say under the font tab in the properties window I give this text some geometry, I extrude it up, and let's say I now want to turn this text object into a mesh. Well, right now if I go up to Object, I can go to Convert To, and I can select Mesh from Curve Metasurf Text, and there's no keyboard shortcut for that by default in 2.8. There was in Blender 2.7 and before. I think it was Alt-C. I can't remember. So if I actually want to add this to my own quick menu, because it's something that I do all the time, I can right click on it and I can say add to quick favorites. It's really that easy. You can do this with anything you can find in a menu. And once you do that, you can press Q on your keyboard and it'll be right there. I can do it from this menu right here. And now my boring CG text is a mesh. If I press tab now, there it is. It's a mesh. I can access my vertices. But what if you actually want to add your own keyboard shortcuts for specific things? Well, that's easier than ever now as well. If I go up to, in fact, I'm not going to go up to anywhere. I'm going to right click to bring up my object context menu. This is a menu. I can add keyboard shortcuts for these things. If I want to add a set origin to geometry keyboard shortcut, there is no keyboard shortcut for this right now. You can see that my text, its origin is right over here. I would want to make it into the middle of this text object as quickly as I can. So again, I'm going to right click, set origin to geometry. I'm going to right click on this and say assign shortcut. Now when you do this, you put your mouse in this little press a key section and you press a key. This does not work, I think, with multiple keys or a command. So I'm going to try T on my keyboard. And let's see what happens. I'm going to press T. There you can see it now has a keyboard shortcut. So I'm not going to do it yet, but then I can press T. And as you can see, that little orange dot, my origin, went to the middle of that mesh object that was a text object. So that is the quick favorites menu with the Q key. And then you can also add your own keyboard shortcuts by right-clicking on anything in a menu. Let's talk about the last two tools on the bottom of the toolbar. Those are the Annotate tools and the Measure tools. Annotation is a new tool that replaces the old grease pencil tool. The old grease pencil tool allow you to draw on your viewport. You could actually animate on your viewport, and what it was used for is to make notes and little scribble drawings on top of a scene. In case you were, say, a director of a 3D animated movie and you wanted to give feedback and notes to the animator of a scene, what you could do is get their file and then you could watch their animation of, let's say, a character, and you could, draw different poses. You could say, okay, I want this character to be posed more like this, and you could quickly draw it. Same thing here. If I take this tool, I can now just simply draw in my viewport, and because we now have quick settings for tools up here, you can see I can change the color of that. I can keep drawing. But with this tool, where does it actually draw? Well, right now it drew in line with the 3D cursor in my scene. So because I was looking diagonally at my scene downward, that's how it drew it from my perspective up there. But you can change where it draws. Right now it's drawing in line with a 3D cursor. I can actually draw on my view. So if I draw now, it'll actually stick to the glass essentially of my viewport. I can also actually draw on the surface of objects. So if I go to a corner and then draw, let's say, a happy face, well, the happy face is going to look pretty distorted because it's on two different sides of my cube. These do not render, but they're handy for notes. If you press N on your keyboard to bring up the side panel, there's a new section for this. There are layers, so if you want to have different colors or separate things out, you can press this little plus. You can choose a color for each layer. Each layer can only have one color, and then you can draw, and each individual stroke can have its own placement, so either 3D cursor, view, or surface. So that is the Annotate tool. The next tool, I'm going to go ahead and get rid of these two layers, is the Measure tool. And so if you ever want to measure anything in your scene, let's say you're doing architecture or 3D printing, this is how you can do it really, really quickly. The Measure tool simply works by, once you have it enabled, it's an active tool after all, you can click and drag in your scene and measure anything. So now I know roughly this edge is 1.48254 meters. Okay, how do you be more exact, and how do you get rid of these off of your screen? It seems like it's, stuck on my screen. In fact, that wasn't accurate at all. What you can do is you can, with the tool still enabled, you can drag one end off of the screen and it'll entirely disappear. So that's how you can easily erase it. But what you can do here, if you want to snap to vertices and edges, in fact, is you can hold Control, but you don't do that right away. So I'm just going to without holding Control, I'm going to click and drag from that point, and that one's not quite accurate. But now if I hold Control, you'll see it'll kind of stick to an edge very accurately, and it also snapped to vertices. So now I'm holding Control still, and it snapped to that vertice. I can go back, hold Control, and I can snap this one to that vertice, and now I know that this edge is exactly 2 meters long. Okay, so that's a really quick, and I'll do it one more time. You can simply click and drag, and then once you start dragging, hold Control to snap, and then you can hold Control still and snap. If you want to measure an angle, I'm going to drag this one off. This is also a protractor tool. So let's say I don't want to use my cube because I know everything is 90 degrees, so I'm going to get rid of it. I'm going to press Shift A and add a monkey head. Of course, it's a go-to. If I want to measure this angle, I can just again click and drag, but I want to drag from this point to this point because I'm going to drag the middle of my measuring tool out to create a protractor with an angle. So again, I'm just going to click and drag from roughly that point. I'm going to hold Control. It'll snap to that vertice. I can correct this one, again holding Control still, and then I can drag anywhere in the middle of my line, and aha, I get an angle. And I can hold Control again, and I can snap to that edge and that vertice, and now I know that this angle is 66 degrees, so that is the Measure tool and the Annotate tool. One of the big new features of Blender 2.8 is the new Grease Pencil 2D animation tool. The Blender Cloud actually a few months ago sponsored the production of an animated short using the new 2.8 Grease Pencil tools. It's called Hero. You can check it out online. I'll put a link to that in the description area below. The Grease Pencil tool is a fully fledged 2D animation tool built into Blender, and it's getting a lot of attention in the 2D animation world. If I go ahead and delete my default cube and I press Shift A on my keyboard, I can actually add a new Grease Pencil object. This is actually a 2D object in 3D space, but it uses new stroke objects. And with this object selected, I can actually press Tab on my keyboard. Oh, pardon me, I'm going to press Control Tab to bring up my different modes, and I'm going to select Draw, and now I can actually draw 2D objects in 3D space. But this isn't the ideal scenario. Ideally, actually, you'd have a special layout dedicated to 2D drawing and 2D animation. You can get this by pressing the plus button and selecting 2D animation, and there we go. But I'm just going to go up to File, New, and select the template for new projects called 2D animation. When you do that, you get a white canvas that you can start drawing in, and you can just click and drag right away. You can animate really easily too in here. So very quickly, I'm going to press Control Z on my keyboard. I'm going to draw a slightly larger brush. I'm going to draw a happy face, and I'm going to do a very, very quick animation. So as you can see, my happy face, don't laugh, has 1 frame. And if I go, let's say 8 frames later or so, I can pan down and I can draw maybe a stretched happy face, like he's falling. And I want to see the old version still, so I'm actually going to turn on, where is it? It is onion skinning. There we go. There's actually a section for it under the Grease Pencil option. So now I can keep drawing. There's the eyes. I got to stretch out the eyes. There we go. And the mouth. Now, keyframes in this 2D animation happen, or the frames happen when you get to their keyframes. So the first picture lasts from frame 1 all the way to frame 7, and then the new picture comes at frame 8. But as you know, if you've done any 2D animation before, especially in software, that you should do in between frames. So I could actually go halfway in between. When I let go of the playhead, I get my current frame, and I get my onion skin of the next frame. So now I can start drawing in between. So I'm going to draw something like that. That's pretty terrible. And I'll draw my eyes and my mouth. And so now, as you can see, I can drag through, and I have a very quick animation. I'm not going to do these tools justice, but there's a lot in here. Check out that Hero movie in the description area below. Lastly, Blender now supports multiple windows. So if you're somebody who has multiple computer screens on your computer, you can actually have a different Blender window on each screen with the same file open, and they work together. What am I talking about here? Well, I'm going to go ahead and snap this Blender window to one side of my screen. And now if I go up to Window, I can say New Window, or even New Main Window, but I'm just going to do New Window. And what this does is it opens the same Blender file in another window. But now what I can do is I can make, let's say, one window be rendered. So I'm going to press Z on my keyboard, switch to rendered maybe I'll turn off overlays, and maybe I'll actually get rid of my other windows here by merging them together, and like that, and like that. And so now I can see my finished version over here, and in this window I might have it in solid view, or even I'll tap Z, I'll go to look dev mode so I can edit my materials. And as you can see, Blender now supports multiple windows. It's a great new feature. Okay, so that's been my intro to Blender 2.8 beta. Did I get anything wrong? Did I forget anything? I'm sure that I did in both cases. Thank you for watching. Of course, if you like this video, if you're learning something, go ahead and click on that like button below this video on YouTube. And if you want to see more videos like this one in Blender and in tech, click on that subscribe button as well, and click on the bell icon to get notified whenever I upload a new tutorial. I look forward to working more in Blender 2.8 and posting more videos in 2.8, especially when the final 2.80 release is released, but there might be more videos between now and then. Again, check out my Facebook page at facebook.com/borncg. On that page, I post sneak peeks and previews of what I'm working on next. Thanks for watching. See you next time. Bye-bye.